So the first phase really continued on with the project that Jeff spoke about, which was the statewide HIA of climate change that was done in WA back in 2006-07. But given the focus of the cluster, we really followed the same format but brought the focus down to Perth, and it was done in conjunction with 3 fairly large local governments in Perth. As Jeff mentioned, and I won't go into detail today, I don't have time, the only real difference was whilst we did kind of a qualitative risk assessment in the statewide HIA, I developed some quantitative health consequence scales which were really useful in comparing the broad range of health impacts associated with different climate-related impacts. So the outcome of that was that the highest levels of health risk for the population of Perth in 2050 was heat, followed by exposure to ozone. Of course, we've heard today that the two of those are actually related through the link to, obviously, temperature. So the rest of the project essentially decided to focus on the element of heat. Oops, sorry. So I really then went back to basics and considered these 3 main elements that contribute to vulnerability of any of these climate-related exposures. And at the same time that I was conducting the impact assessment, the Department of Health had released what's called the West Plan Heatwave, which is essentially an emergency response plan about what are we going to do when a heatwave hits. And I guess because they were already focusing on that, which is clearly looking at increasing adaptive capacity, I became much more interested in this element of exposure. So as Hilary mentioned before, kind of Perth is ahead of the game in terms of this. We're already pretty much hotter than any of the other capital cities, but that increase in temperature is also occurring a little more quickly, and we're also drying more quickly. So the residents of Perth, particularly in recent years with the record-breaking temperature, are well aware of the challenges we're actually already facing. So then I started to think in the next 40 years, as well as climate change projections, we're also faced with an ageing of the population and a doubling of the population by 2050. So partly in response to that doubling of the population and also a recognition of some of the problems that are faced by this continued urban sprawl, we have a very strong policy of urban consolidation. So in areas in Perth that are targeted for urban infill, such as this, kind of an inner city suburb, the typical development pattern is the complete removal of the mature canopy that are provided by the trees, and basically we'll split the block down the middle and replace it with, I think this is called the Bordeaux on the left and the Coonawarra on the right. So despite the artist's impression where they've kind of miraculously put the trees back that they've just chopped down, in reality, a lot of infill developments, such as these real examples shown here, actually design trees out from the urban landscape. So there's very little opportunity. And as well as the infill example up the top, there's also this problem of redevelopment, which is not contributing to urban increases in urban density, but is nevertheless contributing to tree canopy loss. So that obviously has the potential for creating urban heat island effects, both at the micro level where the people are living, but potentially also at a city-wide level. So I then started to use some of the systems approaches and CCM approaches that Katrina mentioned. So this is kind of my example of a co-effects template that I basically called a global local model that is focused on the exposure to heat in urban environments. So on the more left-hand side, we have what's called the global loop, and this is essentially going to be getting hotter, obviously. And the important point to make out is the HIA that I did really looked at that side of the loop. the health impacts of climate change. But importantly, we also have to consider in terms of exposure, which I became interested in, what is really going on in this local loop. And if we meet this target of 154,000 new infill dwellings by 2051, is that going to also relate in a form of local climate change or not? And of course the short answer is, well, it depends on how we do it. So partly in response to that question, I held a workshop with about 34 people, I think, from state and local government, mostly from the 4 sectors shown there, and we really just discussed those issues of how will urban infill affect tree canopy level and heat exposure in Perth in the coming years. And that is the front cover of the report that we released about a month ago that's available on our website. So I won't go into the details of the diagrams, but we basically used a CCM approach where different people or different people from different sectors got together to show their view of the system. I'm really going to just focus on these 2 things: community demand for trees and also urban infill targets. And what we found, whether people were from the development sector or the planning sector or the health or the environment sector, there was this very similar pattern that they saw as happening, which is essentially as tree canopy reduces, there will be a range of tree effects that happen, a range of effects that happen from that. And depending on the stakeholder, those effects were different. Some people saw heat as a major effect, and whilst that was the trigger for the workshop, there were this broad range of other effects. Some people were concerned with property value, so that would be the developers. Other people were concerned with energy demand, influences on physical activity, etc. So no matter what the tree canopy effect that people were talking about, they had this sense that once the community became aware of the issues, they would essentially jump up and down, put pressure on policymakers, put pressure on the marketplace to start incorporating trees back into the environment and slow down or potentially even reduce the tree canopy loss. So a balancing feedback loop. But talking about it a bit more at the workshop and some policy analysis, we realised that the evidence actually suggests that this power of community awareness is undermined by several things. And this quote is from the Capital City Planning Framework that was released at the beginning of the year. And essentially it's, as the quote says, that it's this incremental process, which really means people don't notice. It's bit by bit. The other thing is that because of this broad range of benefits that trees provide, it's almost like a kind of a divide and conquer situation where it's spread out across a broad range of effects, and the links aren't always that easy to make. People don't always make the link between air quality and loss of trees, or mental health and the loss of trees, etc. So really, I came to the conclusion that despite the almost consensus that the community awareness and the feedback provided by that was really, really critical, I think it's actually an example of a very weak feedback and a very delayed feedback as well. So at the same time this is happening, there's a strong awareness, but there's also this other pressure being put on the system that's actually quite effective, which are these strong infill targets. And as you saw from some of those images, that actually has a negative impact on tree canopy. So I really then considered both of these elements in terms of urban planning, in terms of planning policies, which is really very much outside of my area of expertise, but I went there anyway. So Directions 2031, which Annie has already mentioned, is really the platform for the state planning, and it talks about Perth's vision for the future, which is stated here. So if we have a look at the more compact element of the vision, this diagram essentially in the box shows the level of urban density, and it's really being driven by the infill development on the left-hand side, so the rate of urban infill development. And at the moment we have a very nice system where we measure the level of current urban density. We have a very, very clear and well communicated urban infill target, and the gap between the two is effectively driving infill development to achieve our vision of a more compact city. But at the same time, as we've seen in some of those diagrams, it has this unintended consequence on tree canopy. We're increasing the tree removals and we're also reducing the ability or the opportunities to plant trees in urban environments. So what is really missing is a similar thing down the bottom here, where we would have a tree canopy target, which we don't have, where we would have some idea of what the level of tree canopy is now, which we don't have. So there is no current level, there is no target, there is no gap. So we've really lost this, I guess, this opportunity to drive up tree canopy. So I guess without that, in my opinion, we're really progressing towards just a bit of the vision, which is the compact bit of the vision. So if I go back to that original diagram, the question is are we really planning, are we really adapting for a future that's going to be hotter or more extreme, or actually are we helping to create one? And I would suggest in Perth at the moment, with current policy, I would suggest the latter. We are actually helping to create one. And particularly when we consider all those other types of health effects that were pointed out at the workshop, just the sense of kind of a sense of place, the other things that trees provide in urban environments, which I just circled in that, highlighted that by that red circle, they really do, I guess, raise the question of are we achieving our vision to a world-class livable city or not. So the recommendations that came out of that, which I won't go into here, there's a whole list of them there, but basically it just demonstrates that these things are going on in other places. It's not, we're not reinventing the wheel, they are in other places. There's plenty of opportunities to create more compact and healthier, cool communities. It's just a question of doing it. It's not going to happen by itself. It really needs that policy support. So just finishing off, this is my last slide. So we really use heat as an example, I guess, of introducing some systems components to HIA. But in broad terms, about the continued use of systems thinking in HIA, I think there is real potential. I think that it delivered new and important insights that wouldn't necessarily have come out of just a standalone HIA. I found it a very good structure for collaboration. So when the workshop began, when we had developers and environmentalists and health people came in, there was a sense at the start of the workshop that they were coming from very much opposing sides, but by the time they left, they could actually see this, I guess, a shared vision that they agreed upon. They just had different viewpoints of it. So that was, I think, quite powerful and has led to ongoing collaboration. I think practically you would determine the need for systems within HIA at the scoping step. There would definitely be some of the simpler HIAs that wouldn't require systems. And whilst I use systems more in the risk management step, I think there is a possibility that it would also be introduced at an earlier stage